Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to set up a projectile weapon, something that's going to shoot an object from the weapon itself or from somewhere on the player. In the last video we set up a sword attack, and all that was us swinging a sword and checking for a hit with the box collider on the sword. But with something like a spell cast or shooting an arrow from a bow, you don't care about the collisions with the weapon itself, you care about the collisions with the fireball or with the arrow that was shot. So the way we can check to see if we hit something is make sure that the projectile is handling all that stuff, and the weapon itself is just handling the spawning of the projectile, the animation, stuff like that. And each weapon will be in control of everything that happens with it. So we will define on each weapon what projectile it spawns, at what rate it spawns them. So the weapon stats can have like an attack speed, so you can set how often you could spawn these projectiles for that weapon. You could have an attack range, so you could set like how far the fireball travels before it extinguishes itself. And it's all going to be pretty cool, but it's also going to be very simple. So let's go ahead and jump into this by going over how we're going to handle this. First of all, I want an interface that's going to be for all of our projectile-based weapons. And then we're going to set up a staff. So we're going to create a staff from our sword script here. We're going to take that and change a few things and make a couple different things and turn it into a staff. And then we're going to have a fireball script that we will make an object from and allow the staff to spawn that and shoot it in the direction that the player is facing. Right, and that fireball is going to go in that direction for a certain distance. And if it doesn't hit anything, it will just extinguish itself. If it does hit something, it will do damage to it if it's an enemy, or just destroy itself if it's just a different object. So we'll go ahead and get into this. I'm going to first of all set up some of the sword stuff, or the staff stuff. So I want to duplicate my sword script by hitting Control D with it selected. And I'm going to open that up. And what we need to do is I need to have an object on my player that will be the point from which our projectiles are spawned. You could do this on a per weapon basis, so have each weapon have its own point for the projectile. But what I would like to do is have a defined point on the player that all weapons use. That way the player can know for sure where the projectile from that weapon will be shot. So it doesn't mean you have to change your play style whenever you change your weapon. You don't have to change how you aim and attack just because you're using a different weapon. But it's completely up to you how you want to do that. I just want to call this staff and make sure that I change the name of the script file itself to staff. And like I was saying, staff will implement an interface for the projectile weapons. But now what I want to do is I want to go in player. I want to create an empty object, and I'm going to call this projectile spawn, and put it at the top of the player. And we'll just reference that from our player weapon controller, the script here on the player. It'll reference this child, and that will pass that reference to each weapon that it equips if that weapon that it equips is a projectile weapon. And that's something we can set up in the item database. We can set up different types. We're not going to get into that in this episode because that's more the inventory, but I'll show you how we'll go about that in the future. So I have a projectile spawn. I want to go ahead and create a staff so we can have something to equip and attack with. I'm going to take a sword, I believe. We'll take a sword, and I'll put it out here. I'm going to duplicate it and call it staff. Okay, and I'm going to remove the sword script. go back into my scripts and drop the staff script onto it right there. And that's all I want to do on that for now, but I want to bring this up so we can see it. I want to make it look a little different so we can tell that we have the staff equipped. Now I assume yours will look a lot different if it's a staff and not a sword, but since I'm just using these primitives in Unity, it's not like I can get a whole lot of uniqueness going on here. So I'm just going to create kind of like a long stick. Pretty cool. I'm going to not apply that. I'm going to create a new prefab from that called staff. So I have a sword and then a staff. Okay, that's cool. So now I also want to go into weapons. I'm going to create a new folder, somewhere to store my projectile prefabs. So I assume we'll have more than one projectile type. I may not, but you probably will. We're going to create a fireball in this episode. It's not going to be anything. It's not going to look like a fireball. It's just going to be called a fireball, and it's going to be shot out from the player, and it's going to go a certain distance. If it hits an enemy, it'll do damage to it. It's going to have the properties of a fireball, just not going to look like a fireball. So in this, we'll create a 3D object. I'm going to create a sphere. And I'm going to call it fireball. And to keep it with the naming convention we have going on for these, you could make them lowercase. But I don't really know why those are. I guess that's because that's how I did it in the object slug, but that's fine. I'll just create fireball like this. And then I want a script file attached to that we will use to add force to the fireball and then to check for collisions. But I also want a couple of different things here. I want a rigid body for sure. And I'm going to turn off gravity because this fireball is just going to go straight out. It's not going to fall. It's not going to bounce. It's going to go straight out from the player. You could add some cool effects to yours if you wanted it to bounce like a Mario fireball or something. Wouldn't be too hard with the built-in physics engine, but for me, just no gravity, and I'm going to make it about 1/10 of the mass it currently is. And I'm going to freeze the rotation. It doesn't need to rotate. And the position will be frozen on the y-axis. So up and down. That way, if it hits a hill, it won't roll up the hill. It will just hit it and it should just disappear. Should be destroyed. So that's what I need for that. And then I'm going to create my script file. I'm going to call it fireball. And I'm going to attach this to the projectile fireball. So I want to grab this, drag that on that. And there we go. So we have a couple of things set up. All we have to do is go in and add our code in. But I also want to create another interface. What my interface is going to need is it will for sure need a cast projectile method, as this method will be used as an animation event. So I want to be able to control when the projectile is cast based on a frame in the animation. So say we're swinging a staff, and you want the fireball to be cast whenever we get to a certain point in the animation, or if we're drawing a bow back, I want to be able to spawn the projectile that is shot from the player whenever the animation gets to a certain point, or whatever. It's completely up to you again. All right, so I'm going to create a new script file for that interface. It's going to be projectile weapon. And our projectile weapons are going to implement iWeapon as well as iProjectile weapon. So we don't have to write what is in iWeapon in projectile weapon. We just have to add to it. Get rid of all this. It is an interface. No any of that. No any of that. And this is going to have, like I said, we need a property that will contain the reference to the projectile spawn point. So the object on the player where we're going to spawn the projectiles, all weapons that are a projectile weapon need to have a reference to that point. So I want to make sure this has that with like a property. It's going to be a transform because all we need is the transform component from that. Oh, I guess I need to use really want it using Unity engine. There we go. And it's going to be called projectile, oh, capital, projectile spawn, just like that. And then we also need a void method that will be cast projectile. And this will guarantee that all of our projectile weapons have a way to cast a projectile and also know of a spawn point to spawn that projectile. And that's what we need for all of our projectile weapons. So go into staff here. I'm going to add another interface after this that will be projectile weapon. So it is not implemented. I'll go ahead and implement it real quick. Just like that. And I'm going to get rid of these not implemented exceptions. Okay, and it also set up cast projectile right here for me, which is great. So what we need to do now is staff is fine. We will come in here and set all this up whenever we get the information over to staff from, let's say, our player weapon controller. So if I were to go to player and I want to open this up, let's see. What I need is I need to grab a private reference to spawn point for our projectile. So I'll call it spawn projectile. And I'll just do this in start. So it'll be spawn projectile is equal to, and it's a child by the name. We can do it by the name. So I'll do a transform dot, transform dot find child. That's the method you pass in a name of the object and not an index. So it's going to be the name of the object, which in our case was projectile spawn, I believe. And now this should have a reference to that, to the object, or at least to the transform component of that object. And then what I need to do then is when we equip the weapon, what I can do is go through equipped weapon, this one right here, not the eye weapon. Well, we could use the eye weapon. Doesn't really matter in this case. I don't know why we named them such similar names. When I'm going back through this, it's kind of difficult. I don't know why we did that. But go through equipped weapon. Either one would be fine in this case. And get component. And we're looking for the component of eye projectile weapon. And we're going to do projectile spawn is equal to projectile spawn. Nope, projectile spawn. Spawn projectile. That's not what to name it, but that's fine. That'll be fine. And now when we equip a weapon, that weapon will know that it has a projectile spawn. And what's going to happen here is not all weapons are a projectile weapon. So this is going to throw an exception if we try to do this on, say, a sword, right? Because it's not a projectile weapon. It does not implement that interface. So what we'll have to do, as I was explaining before, is we'll have to set up a check to see if this is a weapon that has a projectile weapon. So the way I'll handle this for now is I could just check to see if that get component reference is null. That's fine, but the way we'll do it in the future is when we have an inventory set up is I will actually go through and look at the item type and see if it is, you know, a staff or a bow or a ranged weapon or however we'll set it up in the future. But it's going to be using the item type. So we can just try this and see if we can get through with equipped weapon dot get component eye projectile weapon. So we're going to check for that. It's not equal to null, right? If it's not equal to null, that means we have it, so we can do something with it, and that may work. We'll try that. That shouldn't be a problem. Okay, so with that set up now, staff. Staff is going to need a reference to the fireball that it has to spawn, and it will spawn that at projectile spawn. And then it will add force to that when the fireball is spawned. Well, no, staff will not. Fireball will handle that, right? So all we have to do with staff is spawn the fireball. Okay, should be a problem then. And this is actually not going to be looking for a collision, so we can remove that. All right, so I'm going to do we'll make it a fireball, and I will call it fireball. Now, fireball is the type that we just created, right? There's nothing in it yet, but we created the script file and we created a prefab that uses that. And this is going to be where we instantiate that prefab, but we instantiate it as a fireball type. So it's going to go ahead and grab that component reference for us because it knows what type we're looking for. But it will still instantiate the actual game object itself. It's just the return value will be the fireball component. So fireball, and then start. I guess we could go ahead and set up the way we find the fireball in our resources. Yeah, so I will do a fireball is equal to, see if this works like this, resources.load fireball. Looking for a string path, and we know it's in weapons, I believe, / projectiles, and it's called fireball. That should be the case. Let's double check though. Weapons, projectiles, fireball. That's right. Cool. So it should have us the fireball loaded in, so we can then just use that to instantiate the fireball upon attack. So to do this, what I want, our fireball needs a direction, and it cannot just know that on its own, so we have to pass it a direction, which means we have to pass it the forward vector of our projectile spawn, because it's a child of our player object. So when the player is moving around, so is that transform, or the projectile spawn object on the player. And the way we have it set up is, or the way we're going to have it set up, is anywhere the player looks, the forward of the player is going to be the forward of the projectile spawn. Let me just show you real quick when we set this up. If I go to projectile spawn, it is zeroed on the player. But what I'm going to do is move it out to the front of the player, just like that. So that means that's going to be the point in space where the projectile spawn, right? But since our player can move around, and projectile spawn is a child of the player, projectile spawn will also move around. So if I were to play this, I'll get an error, I'm sure, because I have done some things. But notice it moves around, and see the axis, it stays the same, right? Because it's rotating with the player. And that's what we want. That's pretty cool. So that's how we can get our forward vector that we shoot our fireball down. Notice this is our fireball, and it's way too large. Let's just scale it down. We'll just guess. Something like that, it's fine. All right. So since the fireball will need a direction vector, and it may also need a speed vector, just a speed value, maybe a range that we could pass from our staff stats, but we don't have that set up, right? Again, you could set up stats for your weapons and then use those stats in this case, so you have a range stat for this weapon, and it's range of 30. Well, it can go 30 units before it disappears, and we'll have that set up in our fireball, but we'd have to pass that to the fireball when we instantiate it, which I want to show you how to pass a couple things to it, and then you can take it on from there. Game object fireball instance is equal to game object, going to instantiate. That's fine. And we're going to instantiate the fireball at projectile spawn dot position because it's a transform. And then the rotation is going to be transform dot rotation. Doesn't matter, it's a round ball, right? If you are doing like an arrow, you make sure you want it to be pointing in the direction it's shooting, so you'll just take the player's rotation as we're doing, or we're taking the staff rotation. But you would take like the player's rotation and rotate it that way. Which you could take the projectile spawn, because again, it matches the rotation. And just for the sake of doing that, I'll just go ahead and take the rotation of that. So it should work. You may have to flip it. So if we instantiate a fireball just like that. Then I could take fireball instance. What does the fireball need? It needs a forward vector. So let's actually go ahead and set up our fireball with a couple of the things it needs. So in scripts, I'll have fireball. And in here, we will have a property that is our vector 3, and it's going to be direction. Then we'll have a property that is just a float, and it will be range. Then we'll have a property that is a float or an integer. I believe an integer. That is our damage or our power or whatever. Then you'd have one for speed and all that, and you would calculate your speed based on your character stats and all that good stuff. But this is all we're going to be playing with for now. And then in start, we're going to take the rigid body of this object. I don't know if I can use rigid body. Yeah, okay. So it's got to grab the component through the component now, and it's going to be rigid body. And we're going to do an add force, which is going to allow us to move the object using the physics engine. So at start, what's going to happen is it's going to give it a nudge, right? And it's going to nudge the object in the direction, hopefully, that our player is facing. And the nudge is for 1 frame. So it should be, if we do it right, a consistent and constant force, because we're going to have nothing slowing it down. There's no gravity or anything. So even if we wanted to have something to add some drag to it, we could do that very easily just by modifying the values on the rigid body component. But I want to do add force. And what we're going to do is take the direction vector and multiply it by a speed vector, like your attack speed or your cast projectile speed or whatever. But in this case, just a random value. I'm going to do 50. So we take the direction vector, which we pointing. It's a vector that points in the direction the player is facing. And it's going to be max of 1 on all cases. So what we need is to multiply that by a value that gives it some speed for that 1 frame that it nudges it, right? So it's going to add some force to it when it spawns. And that should be enough for us to play with and see what happens there. So staff is doing that. What I need to do then is take fireball instance and do a direction, right? What's it called? Fireball instance. Oh, see, it's just the game object. So what I'd like to do, actually, we can take this and make it fireball. And then take fireball instance and do a direction. And set it equal to, you know what, I want to do this in, I don't know why I'm doing it up here in perform attack. I want to do this in cast projectile, because this will happen right when we click the button, right? And I want this to happen when the animator tells it to happen. So I'm just going to do it in cast projectile, take fireball instance, do the same thing, and then I'll grab my projectile spawn and just grab the forward vector of that projectile spawn. And that again will give us the facing direction of the projectile spawn transform. And that's what we want, right? So let's see where we are. Let's go ahead and set up this event to fire off our fireball and see what's happening, see what we broke so far. So I'm going to go to animation. In animation, I'm going to grab my staff. And let's say, I'm just going to guess and say about right here. What I'm going to do to add an event to this, an event, I'm going to click add event. And now what happened was it flashed up and it went away. That might be a bug in my version. I don't know, because it'd be nice if it actually stayed up here. But you get this little keyframe at the top here. And this is an event keyframe. And this is something that can call a method, something publicly, a public member on a component that you're animating, right? And I can just right click on this now and go to edit animation event. And it gives me this thing that popped up and went away. And it says, hey, select a function. So I can select a function and you notice you get all these things. Wow, cool. And cast projectile is one of them. So at this point in the animation, a projectile should be cast, right? That's right whenever we're just using the sword animation. I don't really care to make a new one just for this. So what I want to do now is disable that, apply that. I don't have anything to apply it to, but it's applied. And at that point, cast projectile should happen. But right now, whenever we hit V, what are we doing? We're equipping the sword. So I'm going to go to, where's that handled at? Handled in inventory controller. See, we're looking for sword, right? I'm going to leave all this the same. I'm not going to name all this stuff anything differently. It doesn't really matter. But I'm just going to change the object slug that it's looking for. And right now it was looking for staff. It was looking for sword. But looking for staff, which means it'll go into my weapons and grab staff. Which whenever the attack happens, it'll happen the same way, except now it'll spawn something. Let's just see how this is working for us. Hit V. Okay, cool. So you see the staff is equipped. It's the skinny long thing. Hit X. Wow, and it just works. What about that? Isn't it nice when things just work? Hitting X at like halfway through the animation, notice the fireball spawns. As you would expect, it hits things and reacts physically to them, which is something we don't want necessarily for this attack. So what I'm going to do is go to Fireball, and I'm going to set up a distance check in the update. But what I want to do is I need to know first of all where it spawned. So I will set up a vector 3 and say this is the spawn position. And then start, we'll say the spawn position is equal to transform.position. This will give us the position that it was right when it was spawned. So in start, right? And that's going to, now we can use this in update to check to say, hey, how far away are you from where you were when you started? So in update, I'll do an update like that. And I will say if, do a simple check here. We're going to grab, I believe it's vector3.distance. And in distance, we're going to pass it two different vectors. The first vector is the spawn position, the place it started out at. Hands with the wrong key, spawn position. And then the current position. That'll tell us the distance between those two vectors. And if the distance between those two vectors is greater than or equal to our range, in this case, it's not set up for anything, but you could set it up in your stats if you wanted to. If it's greater than or equal to our range, then we need to do something. And what I'll do is set up a method called extinguish. Is this spelled right? Yeah, sure. And what this will do for now is that it will just destroy the game object, just like that. And in the future, what you could do is just set up a sound effect or trigger an animation to make it disappear however you want. But for now, we're just going to destroy it. And what we'll do is we'll call it extinguish if it gets so far away, right? Which is range, which is for now 20. And also, if we hit anything, we want it to destroy itself. But if we hit an enemy, we want to damage the enemy. So I'm going to do a void on collision, enter. Just like that. And this is looking for a collision type of object. I'll call it COL for short. And we're going to check to see what tag is on this. You could check for a component if you want, but we're going to use the tag or an interface, whatever you like. But we're going to use the tag, and we're just going to say if collision, or sorry, if col.transform.tag, because COL is collision, collision doesn't have the tag data, so we have to go, I don't believe, does it? Now that I say that, no. So we have to go through a component that we can reference then the tag object. So I'll take transform.tag. If it's equal to enemy, make sure we do that right. Equal to enemy, then I want to do damage to the enemy. So what I'll do is I take col.transform.getComponent. Again, I can't do getComponent on the collision object itself. Got to go through a component to do a getComponent in this case. And the component I'm looking for would be enemy. And then I will do the same take damage. And however much damage you want to do. In this case, it's just damage. Damage is not equal to anything because we don't have stat set up, but I will do damage is equal to 4. So that's an integer. There we go. And then also it should destroy itself, right? But also if it hits nothing, or if it hits something that's not an enemy, that's how I should say that. If it hits something that's not an enemy, then it needs to destroy itself. And if it hits an enemy, it needs to destroy itself. So I'm just going to call extinguish right there. And that means if it hits something that is an enemy, it will still extinguish itself. If it hits something that is not an enemy, it'll still extinguish itself. Pretty cool. So to test that out, come in here, go and hit V to equip, hit X to attack, hit the signpost so it vanished. Cool. But this is an enemy right here, right? So I want to take this and see what we've got. Just go and hit X. Pew, I missed. Pew. Is it going through it? Pew. 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 What's special about this slime? Did I set the slime up wrong? The slime is a trigger. Why is the slime a trigger? What the heck? What had happened was I accidentally deleted the slime, but I didn't really remember what the settings were on it, so I just created it really quickly without testing it. And as you can tell, I should have tested it. Oh, need to equip a weapon. Pew. Okay, it still goes through it, but still trigger. Pew. 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 All right, what's doing damage? It's sliding off though. I'll make it. I'll set it, since we don't want it to be reacted upon in any way by the physics engine other than checking for collisions, we'll set it to is kinematic. And that should get us where we need to be. If I equip a weapon. Pew, 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 pew. Wait. Oh my goodness. Not a trigger. Should be good now though. Cool. And the distance thing. Wait, how far away can I shoot? Apparently pretty far. Okay, it vanishes. I guess it's far enough. Cool. Is it vanishing or is it hitting something? Okay, it's vanishing. All right, so I believe that's going to be it for this episode. We created a simple projectile-based weapon, but you can take this and apply it to many different things. This is just kind of the basis for understanding how we could go about using the weapons to do more than just physically attack something. We can make them do other things because they are their own thing, right? They can do whatever they want because they are a contained thing. They can spawn things, they can cause different effects, they can knock things back if they want to, and other things don't have to. We don't have to go through I'm sure some of you have been through this, like running an if chain or a switch statement to say if this is equipped, then we can do this, or if this is equipped, then we can do that. This is how we're handling this now, so we don't have to worry about conditions, right? Each weapon is its own thing, and that's why it's going to be not crazy when you want to create a new weapon. And like I said, the animation is just a sword animation. You can go in and it has its own animator controller. That was why we set it up that way, so we could just go in here and change this stuff per weapon, and it won't affect anything else. And we can create its own animations. We can have more than one animation. It can play as many animations as it wants. It's just all dependent upon each weapon. That's going to do it for this video, guys. Keep in mind, this series is made possible by the Patreon campaign over at patreon.com/GameGrind. The majority of the rewards for that campaign is just this series and the other one-off videos that I'm doing in between each episode. There are rewards though. If you do pledge, you will get $5 or more. If you pledge $5 or more, you will receive access to an exclusive, not so frequent, but exclusive stream of written tutorials. The last one we did was over buoyancy and working with that effector in 2D in Unity 5. It's pretty cool, pretty fun. It's very short, but it's also just something I do here and there, right? If I think of something cool and I can just write it up real quickly, I don't have to make a video on it. Or if I'm working on something myself and I want to share something that I found, it's just kind of where I'm going to be posting those things. And what's happening is I'm posting them on the forum where you can ask questions directly. It's just the forum post itself is hidden only to those that are $5 or more subscribers on Patreon. If you're a $1 subscriber, you get access to the Discord server. Not the most active server, but it may be in the future if more guys come and join. And there will be more rewards in the future. But for now, I want to mainly focus on the content on the channel because I don't have a lot of time as it is to make these videos. So when I do make them, I want to make sure that they are what you guys want and make sure they're pretty good videos. And it really helps to see the support over on the Patreon campaign. I really appreciate all that, guys. Thank you. If you have any questions, go to GoGameGrind.com. I'll be there to help you out, get you through some of the confusing parts of this whole series. And that's going to be it, guys. My name is Austin, and I will see you next time.